Okay, so I want to talk a bit more about the carpal bones, and what's really important, the best way to memorize the carpal bones is not to come up with some silly mnemonic, but to remember them as individual bones, and a lot of them have little stories and play really important roles within the wrist. So if you can remember the important ones, it's easy to kind of squeeze in the other ones beside them, and also to learn them in terms of relationships to what they do, and it'll be easy to place them. So the proximal row of carpal bones is, and this is a disarticulated hand, so it's a little bit trickier maybe to kind of figure it out. But this is the scaphoid, the lunate, and then the triquetradum with a pisiform on top. That's the proximal row. The distal row is the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. So going with the proximal row, the scaphoid is also called the navicular because some people thought it looked like a boat, which it does kind of on its side. The important thing to remember about the scaphoid is that whenever you put a lot of pressure through your wrist, that force and compression is going to be taken up by the scaphoid. All right. If you think of the word scaphoid, think of the word scaffolding. What is a scaffolding? Something you climb up to for building. You could think that scaphoid is kind of what is part of the building of your wrist. But the important thing to remember is that it's the most frequently fractured carpal bone, and that's because whenever you put your hand down, it's in the line of fire and it's going to get broken. So that's the scaphoid. It's the most radial of the proximal carpal bones. Next to it is the lunate for the moon, and the lunate is the key part of the radial carpal joint. The lunate is the most frequently dislocated bone, and that's because it's a little hard to appreciate on this disarticulated skeleton. It's kind of wedged in between the scaphoid and the triquetradum. It doesn't have a ton of support, so if a lot of pressure comes through the wrist or if the scaphoid is compromised, the lunate's going to kind of squeeze out. All right. So scaphoid, most frequently fractured bone; lunate, most frequently dislocated bone. And then on the end here, what's really the end of the proximal row is the triquetradum. So you can think of tri is 3. The triquetradum is the third one over, going from a radial to ulnar direction. On top of the triquetradum is the pisiform. Okay, pisiform, P, it's literally a little bump. It's actually kind of palpable, this little bump kind of at the base of your wrist. So what's important to remember is that the pisiform is on top of the triquetradum. So if you see a dorsal view, and again, this is kind of a disarticulated skeleton, but if you're looking at a picture in an anatomy book and you see the dorsal view, you will not see the pisiform because it's actually on top of the triquetradum. Okay? So really that proximal row is really kind of 3 bones, the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetradum, with the pisiform on top. And the proximal row is considerably more flexible and loose compared to the distal row. So distal row, again going most radially, you have the trapezium. Now the trapezium articulates with the first metacarpal. And just to wax a little philosophical, trapezium kind of sounds like trapeze. And if you think of a trapeze artist, you think of people flipping around and doing kind of amazing things. And if you think about your hand does amazing things. It's arguably what makes us human. If you think about what people would define as human qualities, those are mostly cerebral, cognitive qualities, but they are all expressed through our hands. All right? And what makes our hands really functional is your thumb. If you think about if you didn't have your thumb, what you could do with your 4 fingers, you'd be really limited, all right? That amazing mobility of your thumb, of that first metacarpal, comes from the Cmc joint, that articulation between the trapezium and the first metacarpal. So you can think about trapezium, a trapeze artist, the amazing things that a trapeze artist can do, amazing things your thumb can do, that your hand can do. You'll remember the trapezium is what articulates with the first metacarpal. Next to that is the trapezoid. And the trapezoid is kind of a small bone. It's not super important, and it's literally kind of trapped between, kind of wedged in between that trapezium and the capitate. The capitate is the largest carpal bone. It's literally the big one in the middle. So whenever you see a picture of carpal bones, you should just look for the biggest one in the middle, and that will be the capitate. It's also what Newman calls kind of the capstone of the central arch. And the central arch in your hand is really where you have all your stability. So that capitate is really key for stability. It's the big one in the middle. And at the end is the hamate. And the hamate is named for the hook. And it's quite sizable. So whenever you're looking at a picture of bones, you should really look for that hook. And I should note that the trapezium does have a tubercle on it, which in some types of pictures may look kind of similar, but the hook is really quite large and quite significant, and that's what establishes the hamate. And it's the last one in that distal row of bones. So again, you have your proximal row, you have your scaphoid, your lunate, your triquetradum. The scaphoid is what's going to be most frequently fractured. It's going to always be articulating with the radius. The lunate, the moon, is kind of the frequently dislocated one. It's kind of wedged in there, and it actually is the key part of the radiocarpal joint. And then you have the triquetradum, 3, right, for tri, so it's the third one over. It's actually the last bone in that proximal row. And then the little pisiform bone, pisiform a P that sits right on top of the triquetradum, that's your proximal row. Your distal row, your trapezium, remember your amazing thumb, your trapezoid, that's trapped between the large capitate and the trapezium. The capitate is the big one in the middle. It's where the axis of rotation for all movement in the wrist. And then you have the hamate with its large hook. And those are the carpal bones of the wrist.